Thank you so much, everybody. This is almost as full a house as we can possibly have in Udinese Trust. It's so lovely to see you. My name is Cameron Petrie, and I'm one of the trustees. And I have the honour tonight of being the chair for an old friend and a wonderful scholar who's going to speak to us. I believe several people who've not been to the trust before. It's useful to explain that the trust is a very special and specific institution in Cambridge, and we have a board of trustees. We have friends of the trust. We have a wonderful library, and we have a seminar to which everyone is welcome. And it's very nice to have the opportunity to present a little bit of a combination of archaeology, art history, heritage, theory, and perceptions this evening. We're going to have a very exciting talk from my friend and colleague, Professor Naman Ahuja, who is from JNU, Jawaharlal, I will never pronounce this correctly, Nehru University in Delhi. Naman and I have known each other since we were both PhD students. He was based at SOAS and did an astonishing piece of work on ceramic palettes in the northern part of the subcontinent, and very much focused on the early historic period. Since then, he has managed to diversify his interest in every single possible direction, geographically, chronologically, thematically. He's been involved with exhibitions internationally, very, very important exhibitions within India, constantly consulted on all manner of different sorts of things. He gave a really exciting presentation earlier in the week to what was an embarrassingly small audience in the Department of Archaeology on one of the most important topics, really, the Piprawa relics that were put on sale by Sotheby's earlier in the year and were withdrawn from sale, and then have a whole complex story. And if anyone would like to hear the story again, they can go to London and hear it later next week, and I'll maybe get Naman to give him a personal advertisement for what's happening later. But he is visiting at the moment. He's here in Cambridge for a few days, and he's gracing us with two different talks. And what he's going to be speaking about tonight is the title is on the screen: Changing Labels and Changing Time. He's going to be speaking about a specific artifact which was excavated, as he will explain, in the early part of the 20th century, which has a complex history in many ways. And I haven't read your talk, but I know that you're going to give us a great treat. So thank you very much, Naman.
Thank you very much, Cameron. And thank you all very much for being here. I've come back to Cambridge after some 30-odd years. And I remember coming to this house, this building, as a student and consulting the library and photocopying things that I needed to include in my research in 1995 and 96, I remember, was when I used to come in. And I'm very delighted to be back. So thank you all very much. And it's very nice to see so many of you here. And I thought, over the years, my work has, I often find myself having to sort of fight with museum personnel and PR machines, and their ways in which they want to present artifacts from the past in major exhibitions and in textbooks, and they don't allow you to change the language. And our scholarship, as a community of scholars, our perceptions about some of these objects have moved vastly forward, and they're still using labels for some of these objects that go back to the 1930s. And there is an extraordinary resistance to change the labels of certain objects, however atavistic or politically incorrect they may be. And it's not just being politically correct for the sake of being politically correct. These are major issues that need to be considered. So ever since it was first discovered by Rai Bahadur Dayaram Sani in 1926, the so-called Dancing Girl, cast in bronze from Mohenjodaro, has been reproduced in almost every textbook on ancient Indian history as a signature of the technology of the Bronze Age. It is discussed in these textbooks nowadays, but it has stopped being illustrated quite recently. It's been pulled out of Indian textbooks. The nudity of the figure, its identity, and consequently even the label by which it is to be known have been a subject of no small amount of consternation. Now, there have been many other scholars before me who have hinted at the problematic nature of the nomenclature of the dancing girl, I wish to take up the labeling head on to reflect on what expectations of histories have been given priority. I'll try and unpack the reason for what these priorities might be. Um, One label that has held the public imagination for the past 99 years has been Dancing Girl. I shall focus first on the long legacies that have led to retaining this name, even as there have been many scholars, as I said, who have opposed it. Opposition to this name comes from various quarters, yet none of those voices seem to get much attention except one camp. This is the voice of those who wish to give her a religious name of one goddess or another, right? They seem to get a lot of traction and they seem to be allowed, and a lot of newspapers are quite interested in changing her nomenclature to becoming the name of some goddess or the other instead of being a dancing girl. Now, all these alternative labeling suggestions try to retrofit Brahmanical or Hindu nomenclature on a figurine that may be as ancient as 2500 BC. I shall attend to some of these alternative labels in today's talk. Now, before we begin, let us note, however, that however we may interpret this tiny sculpture, it makes an important statement. It's a youthful girl who stands utterly confident in her stance with her head tilted back and her right arm akimbo. Technologically and aesthetically, this sculpture remains a powerful image of South Asia's past. Now, why was she called Dancing Girl, and when did that name first start? Well, amongst the most important things that people forget is that there were various socialist narratives of modernism. It came from very noble intentions, focusing on working class, everyday people shorn of the artifice of the bourgeois. And that is epitomized by the success of Degas in the West and the expectations simultaneously of modernism in India. In 1926, when the Indus statuette was discovered, the requirement to adopt modernism was an urgent imperative of Indian intellectuals and institution builders. A spirit of modernism was needed that would not alienate the people of India from the richness of their history. Modernism that was a product of enslavement, of colonial power, but a modernism actually that was captured in a spirit of freedom as well. How would you define that spirit of the modern in an Indian consciousness? That came a modernism that could come from India's own history rather than a modern that was going to come from aping the West. Few things could sum that up as the spirit of this statuette would. At the same time, we must recognize the profound shift that had been taking place in art circles and salons of the Western world since the 1880s. Painters and sculptors were increasingly moving and embracing a shift to the genre of the everyday, changing the subject matter of their works towards the toiling working classes, in which the honesty of hard labor was shorn of the artifice of the aspirational bourgeois. And that was the new ideal in world art, right? That was what was going on in all the salons of the Impressionists. So Edgar Degas' ballerinas had become famous in the art world circles, and the Mohenjodaro statuette, they both share something in them of their pose and their mood, confidence for sure, but even a certain insouciance or perhaps a little defiance. At the sixth Impressionist exhibition in 1881, Degas presented the only sculpture that he would ever exhibit in public, The Little Dancer Aged 14. Its realism shocked viewers, yet its frontality was reminiscent of ancient sculptural forms. The wax figure dressed in real clothes was modeled on Marie van Getem, one of the many working class ballerinas at the Paris Opera. The subject matter attracted other French artists as well, indicating the inauguration of the quotidian as a motif in the modern. Futurist collaboration in ballet and the search for atavism in modern dance, drawing heavily from the non-West, marked these decades. India had found its own equivalent that showed something of the spirit of the age. But this cannot be the only context for the name. we need to explore another tenacious aspect of the word dancing in the name Dancing Girl, which is the West's fascination with modern dance was rising alongside the rise of exoticism and Orientalism, with the rise of Mata Hari dancing in the library, as you see, of Émile Guimet, which later becomes the Musée Guimet. Um, and this is before she is accused of being a spy. Or you have over there the ballet russe. Um, and Mata Hari was famous for doing Brahmanic dances, as they would be called, right? And the ballet russe was performing the Blue God and other such performances were going on the Western stage from the 1880s onward. And so there is this requirement for the Indian dancer and the Indian theatre. Sylvain Lévy was working on the history of Indian theatre. There were major Sanskrit works that were being translated. Shakuntala, of course, had been translated and been studied endlessly by this time. So Degas was not alone in his fascination with dance. In fact, a number of great Western artists like Rodin, Redon, Gustave Moreau had been sculpting and painting Oriental theatre, epics, and dancers. And this was happening alongside actual performances of Indian theatre and dance on the Western stage. Anna Pavlova, Ruth St. Denis, uh, Roshanara, whose real name was Olive Craddock, Ragini Devi, um, Ragini Devi, whose real name was Esther Luella Sherman, Madame Menaka, whose actually real name was Leela Sokhe, was married to General Sokhe um, in Bombay, were critical mediators, not merely in taking the classical traditions of India to the West, but also inventing them for the Indian intelligentsia, right? It wasn't just that they were delivering the voice of India and Indian dance for the Western imagination, but this became the basis for understanding what was Indian culture for the educated Indian as well at the same time. Mata Hari, for instance, Margaret Azelle, was an exotic dancer before she was accused of being a spy. Olive Craddock, an Anglo-Indian, was really the first dancer to teach Anna Pavlova what may be considered her first true contact with Indian dance in Europe. Few know that the famous actress Betty Davis was taught by Roshanara. Roshanara is who you see here, Olive Craddock, before she tragically died as a young woman in the 1930s. Again, all this is confirming the attitude of the spirit of the age, modernist, exotic, and with a touch of primitivism, right? Which is what we want of modernism. Our bronze statuette from Mohenjodaro was found in precisely this period in 1926. However, let's now go a little further back to an exceptionally rich history of the term dancing girl in Indian and the Orientalist imagination. Nach is the common Indian word for dance, and Noch girls and Noch girls were widely used as entertainment for colonials. They epitomize a complex narrative of Orientalism within colonial Indian history, and one that found support amongst the Indian upper castes. John Marshall and Mortimer Wheeler, preeminent archaeologists emerging at the end of the Victorian period, were clearly a victim to this rather particular kind of Orientalism, evident from their descriptions of the bronze figurine. And one should read how they describe this bronze figurine, because you'll see that they were educated by Victorian schoolmasters. I mean, it's clear that, in the way they have in their writing, it becomes quite clear. So what I wanted to say as we look at these pictures and you look at the certain similarity in the poses and the striking similarities, and this painting was just sold day before yesterday at Christie's. It comes from the collection of, it was in the collection of Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, and it was sold. So I'd say, I think I'm told for a record sum of money. That's a courtesan from Delhi, and very much you see the pose of the courtesan, and you see the pose of our dancing girl, and these are there's a similar requirement in how these Orientalist projections were being made of Indian dancing girls and Nach girls. Anyway, let's get back to our archaeologists. Yes, let's get back to Mortimer Wheeler and John Marshall. I'll read out something by Marshall first. This is a small figurine of rather rough workmanship with disproportionately long arms and legs. Almost, indeed, it is a caricature, but like a good caricature, it gives a vivid impression of the young Aboriginal Nautch girl. Her hand on hip in half-impudent posture and legs slightly forward as she beats time to the music with her feet. Small too, as this figurine is, the modeling of the back, hips, and buttocks is quite effective and, in spite of obvious defects, shows sound observation on part of the artists. Mortimer Wheeler, her little Baluchi style face with pouting lips, an insolent look in the eye. She's about 15 years old, I should think, not more, but she stands there with bangles all the way up her arm and nothing else on. A girl for the moment, perfectly confident of herself and the world. For the moment, while she is a dancer. Otherwise, this Aboriginal little impudent girl would never be. No, but that is what he's saying, right? Otherwise, she'd never have the freedom and the self-confidence. It's during the nach, during the moment of performance, during the dance, that she can embody and become that character that she is capable of being, right? And so during the dance is when we get to see her, which we wouldn't get to see her when she is off stage. And so it's quite lovely to see these understandings of performance, of sculpture, of art, of the Nautch girl, of what it enables. Ernst Mackay, too, who found the Karachi Museum. There are, by the way, two such dancing girl statues. One lies in the National Museum, India, which I'm focusing on. There is another one, which is in the National Museum of Pakistan, which is lesser known, and I will also show you. So Ernst Mackay, who found the Karachi Museum's figure, equated her with Devadasis, the temple dancers of India. According to him, this figurine may well have been one of the temple dancers of Mohenjodaro, right? He puts it down to that in 1935, writing about her. Now, lest we imagine that Mackay, Wheeler, and Marshall are being singled out in my presentation as exemplars of Western Orientalism, we should pause to reflect on how Indians themselves were culpable of supporting such stereotypes. This is further complicated by the nationalistic revival of an authentic Indian classical dance located in an idealized Sanskrit landscape that was going on in India at this time. There was this urgent requirement to reclaim an Indian identity and to find a classical India that was located in Bharatanatyam dance, for which the great temple dancers and the Sanskrit tradition were supposed to be the deliverers of the pure tradition of India, of the ancient past of India that was going to come down to us, however much that might actually have been a tradition that went through many generations of 2000 years of change, but everyone would quote Bharata's Natya Shastra as being the one source from which this Bharatanatyam is supposed to have come. This has led art historians like Prithvi Agrawal, for instance, to try and make a connection between the specific mudras of dance embodied by the Indus bronze figurine with terms used to describe them in the Natya Shastra. He says, and I'll quote him, "This great proto-historic dance tradition with its rudimentary definitions of mudras and gestures appears to have persisted without any break in the historical culture of India, though it must have been further elaborated by the Natya exponents of subsequent ages," he reluctantly admits later. Proving the antiquity of Indian tradition through its oral and performative cultures had become a national policy projected through the newly founded agencies of the government, such as the ICCR, the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, the Sangeet Natak Academy, and the Lalit Kala Academy. So the Indian state was quite interested in projecting this national culture, right, of Indian dance. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a dancer, and a dancing girl need not be a term that is pejorative at all. Scholars have advocated for an individual agency of the Nautch girl beyond the colonial patriarchal gaze. And so here are two bibliographies for students who might be interested, where I've looked at a small bibliography I've given you over there for anyone who's interested on modern gender politics associated with the Nautch and with Devadasi culture. And here's a little reading list on that. But then there is a little reading list I've also given parallelly on gender studies and feminism in South Asia, which I think is a pretty important reading list on a history of the working woman and a history of physical labor associated with women's bodies that can also be looked at in parallel, along with this history of what performance theory people and performance history people have been writing up. And two bibliographies together, looking at psychoanalysis, gender studies, and the role of women in art, looking at these two readings together, um, acknowledges a very particular binary in Indian attitudes towards gender, which is unable to break out of a certain model of the dancing girl versus the mother goddess, right? The dancing girl is somebody who is pleasurable. The mother goddess is somebody who is venerable. One is an apsara or a surasundari or a courtesan. The other becomes a devi who is a mother goddess, right? One is an entertainer, and one you salute immediately and say ma, right? Um, one is seldom pregnant or never pregnant. One is a matrika. And so the two labels we have ended up with as a dichotomy in the Indian press is that should she be called dancing girl or should she be called Parvati? Now, the claim to call her Parvati was first made by Thakur Prasad Verma, a retired professor of BHU, the Banaras Hindu University, in an article called Vedic Sabhyata Ka Puratattva, the archaeology of the Vedic age. And it came out in 2016, and it's been much lauded and much tom-tommed over the internet. And there's been a lot of pressure on the National Museum of India to change the label to Parvati, right? Now, what's interesting is that this, as I was saying, this role model, the Indian Council of Historical Research, the ICHR, even suggested relabeling the dancing girl to Parvati, the goddess, based on this claim made by Thakur Prasad Verma. The support received for the conscious act of relabeling the dancing girl into the goddess Parvati highlights the lack of space in the Indian psyche to imagine a respectable working class woman, right? That you cannot valorize and celebrate. There is no room for a label which celebrates a working woman in the National Museum of India. You can either put her there as a dancing girl or you are allowed to put her there as a goddess, right? And there doesn't seem to be, nobody is interested in an alternative label for her. We are left asking what prevents the identity of this proto-historic female figurine to move beyond the binary categories of Apsara and Devi. Psychoanalysts have long established how the ancient archetype of mother goddess and pleasure-giving prostitute remain entrenched in the most patriarchal mythic archetypes. And this has been shown to be true in South Asia time and again. Even in the 21st century, then, for all the advances we imagine feminism has made, we are left asking if a working woman commands the position of respectability traditionally reserved for goddesses. And are there other possible categories of the working woman apart from that of the prostitute or amusing dancing girl? That's the other thing to think about. Okay, so before we carry on this sort of polemic, let's do a little formal analysis of the image itself. On the left is the one found in Karachi, is lying in the Karachi Museum. On the right is the one lying in the National Museum in Delhi. What are the alternative ways through which we can present this figurine to the public? So much for critiquing the current ways. As art historians and archaeologists, our first methodological approach is through a formal analysis, both of its morphology and its metallurgy, apart from what we can glean from its archaeological context. In most textbooks, the image of this figurine would come alongside an introduction to the Bronze Age, and in art class, it would be held up as one of the best and first examples of a bronze or copper alloy figure made from the lost wax casting technique. Now, as I said, two bronze dancing girl figures are known. Both come from Mohenjodaro. One is kept in Delhi's National Museum and the other in Karachi's. The one in Delhi was excavated by D.R. Sani in 1926-27. It's 108 millimeters high, so 10.8 centimeters. It's cast in solid bronze using the lost wax process and shows this thin young woman with her head tilted slightly back, like I said, right arm akimbo, left leg bent at the knee. The figure has some very refined detail, slightly upward tilted face with heavy lips, a rounded nose, and slit eyes. Her ornaments include a beaded necklace, and perhaps this might be significant, only one, her left arm, is heavily bangled. Its place of discovery, according to Marshall, was by the side of a little fireplace, which is also evident from other metal objects like a copper spoon, a copper statuette of an elephant, which were all found at the same spot in the excavation at Mohenjo-daro. So we know the location of its discovery. The other figure, which is now in Karachi, was excavated by Ernst Mackay 4 years later in 1930-31. Although it seems almost identical to the other figure at first glance, there are differences between them, and that actually alters the interpretation. The Karachi one is 2.7 centimeters taller. The Karachi figure's legs are straighter. It is her left hand which is placed on the hip, with the elbow projecting to the left, while the opposite arm is placed on the hip in the Delhi figure. The Karachi figure extends the right hand out in front of her waist, holding a small bowl or some offering, while the Delhi one has a gesture of holding on to something with her left hand. It's a socket. Her left hand, it's clearly a hole. She's holding on to something. It's an empty socket that she's. Both figures wear many bangles on their upper left arms, and a few bangles are indicated above the right elbow, which are fixed in place, which won't move around. Even though Shireen Ratnagar has called the Karachi figure the ugly sister and said it does not have the charm like the other one now in Delhi, Karachi's elegant female figure from Mohenjo-daro stands with her head held high, her hair tied in a horizontal bun, low on her neck. Traces of long almond-shaped eyes are visible, but the facial expression has been obscured by corrosion. The Karachi one holds herself straight, not leaning back as does the one at Delhi. Although corroded, she appears to have more jewelry, more strings or necklaces cover her chest. There's a hint that she may be wearing a lower garment, like a short dhoti above the knees. Her right hand clearly happens to be holding a small dish or bowl, as if holding something like an open palm, while the Delhi figurine's hand is in a gesture as if it is grasping something. What could the socket created in her left hand have held? Several vertical stick-like things could be suggested, ranging from a javelin, a warrior's spear, or a sweeper's broom, depending on how we wish to label her or position her in our museum. At any rate, this is very different from the attitude of the Karachi figure. In fact, positioning a vertical in her hand produces a remarkable balance to the backward tilt of her body, clearly revealing a difference with the Karachi figure which is not subtle actually, because there's a big difference that comes sculpturally. The minute you add that stick, which we did, we broke a little broomstick, a little jhadu ki tili, and we inserted it, and we saw the balancing out, and it falls quite naturally to counterbalance the tilt of the figure. So it produces this remarkable tilt, revealing a difference with the Karachi figure, which is not so subtle. And the uneven distribution of bangles as well suggests that her working arm, possibly that this is a woman who kept one arm free for a purpose other than just dancing. She may have needed better, a dancer may have needed better symmetry and an equitable adornment of both sides of her body. Everyone who wears bangles knows that they come in the way of working, and to keep the working arm free, women tend to shift their bangles onto the other arm. Could it not be that this is a woman who was capable of working rather than being there as a dancer? Um, at least she appears to be somebody who has a capacity for labor. Why can we not discuss these more formal aspects of this sculpture more openly in art historical narratives? It would be far more empowering. The most that I could manage as a curator when I exhibited the figure in an exhibition called India and the World in collaboration with the British Museum was to put the words dancing girl in inverted commas. It is evident that while academic circles are rapidly advancing new categories that align with contemporary society's demands, the museum and the textbook writer's mindset remains entrapped in a vacillation between categories like mother goddess and dancing girl. Indian feminism has a long history, with education policy incorporating socially empowering narratives for women since the 1940s. Books by Kumkum Sangari and Radha Kumar in the 1980s and 90s explored the history of doing, bringing agency to women's histories that could allow us to look at what the figurine is doing and what she may be capable of doing. However, museums resist changing their labels. Shari Clark and Alexandra Ardenelu Jansen's dissertations made an important intervention in gender studies in Harappan figurines, revealing Harappan's non-binary approach to gender. In this context of Indus figurines, determining sex and gender requires either clear anatomical features or interpretation based on costume. Contextualizing Harappan costume, however, turned out to be far more challenging for us. I'm now moving to the next generation. If the 1980s and 90s were about a feminist discourse, certainly the late 90s and 2000s have come up with a whole other way of looking at Harappan figurines, which have been from more contemporary studies on gender, which is not even thinking in terms of binaries. Certain costumes or jewelry may be representations of fanciful imports in Harappa, making it impossible to determine if a masquerade represents cultural mores, right? Is a masquerade actually a part of a culture, or is it just an exotic import for a moment in that society? So if you see a representation on an artwork, is it actually an authentic representation of how that civilization believes? Or is it that special moment that you're photographing when you dressed up in costume? Right? And if it is a special costume, then we can't then historically look at it as being representative of that culture. It was a maverick moment in that culture. Harappan terracotta figurines sometimes show skirts and necklaces donned by bearded men. And on the other hand, we have figurines of men carrying babies in their hands, and they can't be called mother goddesses. So terracotta figurines from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro have really upset gender normative representations in galleries already, right? And we seldom know how to label Harappan figures for that reason. Contemporary gender roles and attires are not always relevant in ancient societal contexts. Thus, isn't it paradoxical that while Harappan figurines have epitomized interest in transgender cultural moorings over the past 25 years, I've spent the better part of time discussing why older 19th century historiography of Brahmanical, patriarchal, colonial mindsets have conditioned our resistance to amend the texts that accompany this figure. Right? There's so many other new things that have been happening. Moreover, as figurines that epitomize South Asia's Bronze Age, they deserve an alternative narrative delving not just into Indus metal craftsmanship, but also networks of exchanges, mining, trade, as well as migration. The three major zones of mining copper in the mature Harappan phase include West Asia, Eastern Iran, and Rajasthan, right? Where did the copper for this sculpture come from? If I wanted to discuss that. And along with copper, did the culture from Rajasthan, Iran, or West Asia also come along with it? So is it just a representation of the Indus Valley dancing girl? Or could it actually be the cultures of the copper bringers who have made this figurine in Mohenjo-daro or brought it to Mohenjo-daro from any of those places? The trade networks interspersed between these zones, along with communities of sedentary agriculturalists and semi-nomadic pastoralists, enabled diffusion of techniques of smelting and casting. A distinct Harappan style is achieved in metalware produced during this period, which differs from contemporaneous production in other regions. A more systematic work, therefore, in this area has been done by the archaeometallurgist D.P. Agrawal with the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in the laboratories in Mumbai in the late 1960s. And nothing has been done on the metallurgy of Harappan material since the 1960s. Since the 1960s. That was the last time Harappan metallurgical studies were undertaken in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And meanwhile, there have been masses of metallurgical studies that have been done on the Bronze Age all over the rest of the world. So our labels are, even in terms of the history of technology, archaeologically, woefully backward. Agrawal provides us with a data set for the nature of metal compositions of bronzes at Indus Valley sites. Out of the 177 artifacts analyzed earlier from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, only 30% were alloyed. The alloying range was from 1 to 2% in 1 to 12% in tin, 1 to 7% in arsenic, 1 to 9% in nickel, 1 to 32% in lead. Tin bronzes were more common than other alloys. The Harappans knew the technique of sinking, raising, running on, cold work, annealing, riveting, lapping, closed casting, siripper dew, as shown by human and animal bronze figurines, he says. Super interesting things to talk about, actually, on a label in a museum. I can imagine all the kids in the IITs coming to the National Museum being quite enamored by looking at the chemical metallurgy and the physical metallurgical properties of this figurine. But none of that information is told to us when you go to the National Museum. So the chemistry students and the metallurgy students learn nothing, actually. This furthers an expanded understanding of ancient bronze alloying, not one limited to type and the ratio of mixing copper and tin, but various amounts of arsenic, nickel, and lead. Techniques for ancient metallurgy, including casting and fabrication with lost wax casting, have been preferred over stone mold casting in South Asia. Now, this preference benefits artisans. It enabled rapid production and recycling, but it leaves art historians and archaeologists with a certain limited amount of information. Then I'd like to come to another way of interpreting this figure, a new way of thinking about the history of this figure. Which other history can it be used to tell? And this figure has become a symbol of the history of partition. That's another really important history that this figure epitomizes. The disciplines that Indus Valley objects, and this figurine in particular, have come to epitomize include a new discipline called partition studies, which has come up within history. And one of the most significant in partition studies, of partition of India and Pakistan, that is, and subsequently Bangladesh, has become such a major subject of study over the past few decades in departments of history, politics, culture studies, literature, and now even in museological discourse. In 2016, the government of Sindh in Pakistan made a demand asserting Sindh's claim on the object and asked for it to be repatriated. Right? If people think that repatriation claims only come to the Britain's door from India and Pakistan, here is another interesting story now of a repatriation claim that came from the governor of Sindh to India, asking for the repatriation of this figurine to Pakistan. So I'm not just making this up as a story of partition and repatriation. The contemporary artist Subodh Kerkar mounted this installation made out of put a pair of railway tracks and put this silhouette up at the Viceregal Lodge in the garden of the Viceregal Lodge in Simla. Taking inspiration from the discovery of the Indus civilization by a railway engineer, right, which is how Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were spotted and discovered, and placing it at Viceregal Lodge in Simla, where the partition of India was agreed to, right? and putting this modern sculpture up in the garden for all to see. And there lies not the real dancing girl, but the silhouette, the shadow, the vacant space left behind by the dancing girl split between India and Pakistan, right? The empty figure. I think it's a particularly good public work to call attention to partition and the history of what happened at Viceregal Lodge in Simla. Apart from it being such a such a resonant symbol of the division of India and Pakistan, I think it's important to have public works in museums that bring histories of conflict to public attention in some way. And Kerkar managed to do that with this particular sculpture. Few objects can mobilize such a discourse for the public like the two bronze sisters of Mohenjodaro, each now kept in two different nations' national museums. So, with all these possible narratives that were available to us, we still live between Dancing Girl and Parvati, right? But now, very curiously, there is another really solid missed opportunity, or was it willful conservatism? In the end of my talk, I wish to attend to a rather alarming development of the willful conservatism that has been fueled by right-wing political agendas since the 1990s. In the official textbooks for history and social science in India, the dancing girl is not there in the final class 11 or 12 textbooks for Indian history anymore. Friends of mine who work at the NCERT, that's the National Council for Educational Research and Training, have informed me that the image was there up until the 2003 and 4 printing of India's textbooks, but not after 2005. For class 6, the new textbook that has come out after the new education policy, the NEP, has been adopted, it does not include the dancing girl. However, it was there on the cover of the previous national textbooks in the 1990s. It was reproduced widely inside many editions of the history textbooks. The NCERT, the National Council for Educational Research and Training's textbooks, are instrumental in shaping national identity. They are widely read by over 50 million students in 18 states, including those preparing for competitive exams such as the civil services, the state service commissions, the entrance exams all over India, making them a prime target for political parties seeking to sway public opinion. The Class 11 book under the subject of fine arts, in a textbook titled An Introduction to Indian Art, still mentions that there is a statue called the Dancing Girl in chapter 2, but it does not provide an image of the dancing girl, even for art students in the 6th form. The reasons for this erasure have not been put down on any file, right? I've hunted, right, for a file record for the reason for the erasure. But I have been told unofficially by those who attend the meetings that they've been told that the subject is the sculpture is inappropriate because of its nudity. But I didn't know we were being run by the Taliban, right? It appears that that's the case, right? This anxiety about the nudity of the figure has a long history since Victorian times. It's not just modern. When the colonial machinery's ideas of propriety and sanitary urbanity found easier subscription amongst the emergent Indian upper classes. The bare-breasted woman became a symbol of primitivism and of low-caste status, even though art historians knew all too well that this belied the evidence across museums. The massive reprisal of the Hindu right wing against M.F. Hussein's paintings, for instance, and the recent complaints by advocate Amita Sachdeva on Hussein's depictions of nude gods and goddesses as part of an exhibition in Delhi by the Delhi Art Gallery called Hussein the Timeless Modernist, specifically 2 paintings depicting Hindu gods Ganesh and Hanuman alongside nude female figures, was a case in point. Or the banning of the Miss World contest's swimsuit round in India. Or the denouncement of government diaries that had the image of the dancing girl in the government diaries. Those entire lot of government diaries had to be pulped and not used by the government of India because it had this image in it. And now its removal from textbooks is only making this anxiety creep up on us, and it's making this anxiety grow. Now, this is not the first time that nudity, especially female, in art has met with censorship in India. I've written previously about the arguments Abanindranath Tagore and Nandalal Bose had to prevent Gandhi from concealing the Khajuraho and Konark erotic sculptures, while others have widely quoted the 1954 judgment in the case of Akbar Padamsi and the right to have nude models for sketching and life drawing within art schools. Right? These were all battles that were hard won in the 20th century. Gandhi once famously asked Jamnalal Bajaj, the industrialist, to send a couple of truckloads of cement to cover up the nude sculptures, the erotic sculptures of Khajuraho, because it was going to be too embarrassing to show them to the public. And this was also the Victorian sensibility and values that were just like, this is not appropriate. And Nandalal Bose and Abanindranath Tagore had to go from Shantiniketan and spend a week with him at Wardha in Maharashtra, convincing him that it would be a bad idea to spoil Khajuraho. Ditto the case with allowing art schools in India to have nude sketching and have nude models. The matter became a subject of a massive outcry when a clothed version of this figure became the mascot of the government of India for the International Museum Expo in 2023, 2 years ago. A wooden contemporary reinterpretation of the original bronze figurine in the Chennapattanam art style of Karnataka replaced the dark toned bronze figure in an unreal pink skin tone, fully clothed in pink and yellow garments, becoming something which is more reflective of the persistent anxieties around conforming to certain gender norms in the current times. The Ministry of Culture said in a release that the dancing girl of the Sindhu Saraswati Sabhyata served as the design's main inspiration. It added that the mascot was interpreted as a modern-day Dwarpal or door guardian who ushers in the audience into the experience of the Indian Museum Expo 2023. The media in India, however, raised a storm. The shifts in the narrative around museum objects has been the subject of some of my previous writings. It is the responsibility of curators and museum directors to both manage and navigate these shifts with tremendous care, especially nowadays when propaganda and public mobilization on social media can be so easily manufactured. This makes the archiving of the narratives and the rationale for them as important for the museum as is the conservation of the object itself. We're not here to only conserve the object. We're here to conserve our views as a community of academics and why we came to label an object a certain way and what our thinking was. And the museum it is contingent on the museum to preserve our rationale and our thinking on the matter as well, rather than just the object itself. Indeed, new narratives will become imperative for each object with each generation, as we have seen with the Dancing Girl of Mohenjodaro. So to conclude, originally positioned as giving Indian girls an exemplar, the terms at which she has now been incorporated as a symbol of Indian museums make her conform to the very values that she once challenged. One cannot but help wonder if the 4,500-year-old Mohenjo-daro girl were to see this as an assault on her identity. Would she have smiled at the sculptor as suggested by Agha Shahid Ali's 1990 poem called At the Museum, published in the journal Poetry in 1990? In the last few lines of the poem, it celebrates her beauty as a sexual thing for the amusement of older privileged men, while the body of the poem remarks on the extraordinary capacity of her labor that goes unnoticed, right? He acknowledges both opinions. 1990, he wrote this poem, quite a nice poem. Let's read it. But in 2500 BC, Harappa, who cast in bronze a servant girl? No one keeps records of slaves and soldiers. What label are we going to give her is what we are discussing, right? Servant girl, soldier, slave. He's already gone through the three. The sculptor knew this, polishing the ache of her fingers stiff from washing the walls and scrubbing the floors, from stirring the meat and crushing the hing or asafoetida in the bitter gourd in the Karelas. But I'm grateful she smiled at the sculptor as she smiles at me in bronze, a child who had to play woman to her lord. The young dancing girl who is the Devadasi. He acknowledges all the interpretations in his lovely poem, as he put down. So he says, a child who had to play woman to her lord when the warm June rains came to Harappa. It's actually not Harappa, but Mohenjo-daro, but never mind that. Okay. Thank you all very much. I'll end there.